Hi people, so I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which will be to read out an email response that I've received from the Sentencing Council of England and Wales. If you don't know, they're the body responsible for setting sentencing guidelines in England and Wales. Scotland has a different jurisdiction, very similar framework, but um, it's autonomous, it's a devolved power. Northern Ireland, I'm not sure what the situation is there at this exact moment with the political stagnation that has been going on in the province. I'm not sure if there is a functioning sentencing council as such. But anyway, I also got a response from the Scottish Sentencing Council. With them, my contention was about the fact that they regard anyone under the age of 25 as not having fully developed brains. I just think that is outrageous when you consider that in Scotland, like the rest of the UK, you can get married, you can start business, you can join the armed forces, you can smoke, you can drink, you could do pretty much everything at the age of 24. Um, and yet, according to the Scottish Sentencing Council, you shouldn't be treated like a 24-year-old criminal shouldn't be treated the same as a 26-year-old criminal. I think that's clearly absurd. Anyway, with the Sentencing Council of England and Wales, I contacted them with a more specific issue, which was around reckless driving. Um, there was a case recently in Norfolk. People may be familiar with it. A 19-year-old driver, George Taylor, he was driving with his knees, basically, whilst he was filming himself, presumably for social media. And as a result of this recklessness, he hit a woman in her 40s and she's paralyzed from the neck down. Her whole life has changed. He pled guilty, so I imagine that would have been a mitigating factor. But the consequence for this, the consequence for destroying someone's life, he got 2 years custodial sentence, 40-month driving ban, and he had to he has to undergo driving safety course. Now, when he comes out of the Young Offenders Institute, he's going to be still a very young man. He's got the rest of his life ahead of him. Um, Now, I understand that he's not the same as a murderer. I understand he didn't go out that day with the intention of destroying someone's life. But there are far too many examples of young drivers, particularly, and some older drivers, but particularly young drivers, who are just selfish. They think that Instagram hits are more important than safety. In this case, he had had his license for less than 12 months. So it just reiterates how cavalier some young drivers are and how it needs to be, certainly there needs to be tougher criteria, I think, for getting a license. Um, but really, 2 years, that's disgraceful. And I contacted the sentencing council, well aware, I'm very aware that they will not comment on individual cases. But I raise it nonetheless to reiterate the point here that there is a trajectory of these sort of cases where you get overtly lenient sentencing. I'm not going to read out my whole email because it's more or less what I've said here. When I approach these things, I always try to get a balance between you can't just rant and rave because no one's going to respond to that. But I also don't want to be overtly warm and friendly when I do feel strongly about this. And I do believe in being candid. So, I was criticizing the sentencing council I was very open about that. I said, you're the body responsible for setting guidelines in this country. And frankly, your sentencing seems tone deaf. Now they have public consultation. I've contacted them before over a year ago, so I've had a bit of communication with them. They have public consultation. I do question how far that goes. Um, in their email response, they're polite, they're a bit defensive, as I expected. Um, but I maintain my position. I think that the legal establishment of which they are part, and it would be unfair to blame them solely, but they are part of it, still doesn't fully get it. Now, I'll just read this out without further ado, then express my thoughts on it. I may interject at several points just to respond here. I'm not going to read out my whole email simply because it's pretty much what I've said in this video. Anyway, this is their response. It's today. So fair, fair play to them. They responded immediately. I'll give them that. Okay, dear Mr. Hazlett, thank you for your email on the sentence. I'm trying to split screen here without cutting off the video. Let's see. Just bear with me a second. Thank you for your email on the sentences for causing injury or death by driving, the contents of which we have noted. As you point out, the Sentencing Council consulted on the sentence levels for both causing death and causing serious injury by dangerous and careless driving in 2022 and published new guidelines for these and other motoring offences in 2023. The sentence levels for causing death by dangerous driving were increased to reflect the raised maximum penalty set by Parliament. Now, I had mentioned a public consultation. I hadn't mentioned it specifically, but the fact that they have increased it itself is telling. So, 2 years in prison for destroying a woman's life is supposedly an increase. That in itself is telling. Um, Increase or not, it's still too lenient. While various respondents did want to see higher penalties for causing serious injury by dangerous driving, I would imagine it's a majority. They're using diplomatic language there. The council was limited by the statutory maximum for this offence, 5 years custody. Indeed, a sentence of 7 years custody, which you propose, I'd suggest that that's probably more appropriate. Um, would require legislative change and would be a matter for Parliament. Equally, the Council did not agree with those respondents, including road safety campaigners, who thought community orders should be available for this offending, believing that the starting points and ranges for even the lowest categories of this offending marked by custodial sentences. So there you have the sentencing council actually saying they're tougher than some of the respondents. I I'm sure that's true that some of the respondents said that. Although I have to say I've been following campaigners like Road Peace, and they definitely, from what I've seen, I could be mistaken, but from what I've seen, they would definitely veer towards victims wanting tougher sentencing. I haven't yet to see a road safety charity call for softer sentences. I have not seen that so far. I'm not saying the Sentencing Council isn't being honest about this, but I'm not sure what charities they're talking about because the ones I've seen would definitely advocate tougher sentencing in reflection of what victims want. It's good that the Sentencing Council opposed those proposing community sentences. I mean, shame on them. You know, anyone who thinks that, whether they're a private citizen or whether they're a charity that thinks the penalty for dangerous driving should be to clean up someone's garden. You know, if you kill someone or you seriously disable someone, the idea that the penalty for that should just be cleaning a few gardens is outrageous. So at least the Sentencing Council recognises that it should be custodial. I'll come back to the issue about parliamentary mandates on this. That's a very important point, actually. The Sentencing Council's membership includes a senior police officer, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and a representative of victims' interests. They have one representative out of their, I think it's a dozen or so representatives, so they shouldn't, overplay that point. They have one. And I mention that because there's many different types of crime. So one representative dealing with victims seems like an underplay. Like the judicial members of the council who will have experience of sentencing dangerous driving cases, um, they are aware of the anguish and pain caused by offences of death and serious injury by dangerous driving and how difficult such sentencing exercises could be. This was a significant factor behind the new guidelines issued in July 2023. I had specifically asked them that point because my experience of the sentencing council is they're always professional and polite, but in previous correspondence, they have frankly been evasive about this specific issue of anger from victims. You know, they tend to be made up of lawyers and barristers and legal insiders. They're very diplomatic, but there's always a bit of, frankly, I found previous responses a little bit robotic. This one is better. I'll give them that. It's a better response. Um, because they're finally acknowledging the anger that I'm really trying to focus on. Um, it's a better response, but I'm still not overly happy with the Sentencing Council. You know, I'm not happy with the legal establishment as a whole. I'm just going to quote out something. Now, this is from AI. I should caution it is an AI thing. But if you type into Google, do MPs have the power to set sentencing guidelines? Because I'm getting into this issue of parliamentary mandates, and this is what the AI response gives. No, members of parliament do not set sentencing guidelines, but parliament does set the framework for sentencing and legislation. So this is just a brief outline, I should say. Parliament sets maximum and minimum sentences for criminal offences. Parliament is also responsible for contributing to sentencing guidelines as they are produced. In other words, MPs cannot dictate the actual sentences that people get, but they do mandate what is maximum and minimum. That is pretty important because it means that, for example, someone who has caused death or injury by serious driving, there is an absolute minimum that that person will serve. Now, the Sentencing Council, by their own admission, say that the maximum is 5 years. So the 2 years handed out to George Taylor is on the lower end. So that just reiterates my point that it's too lenient. The Sentencing Council, which is the group that I've contacted, develops guidelines that reflect the laws set by Parliament. The Council's primary duty is to provide judges and magistrates with sentencing guidelines. So they do have power. This idea that they're just limited, they're just an advisory board, they do have power. Judges are following their guidelines. Judges and magistrates are responsible for the direct sentencing of individuals in individual cases. They must follow the sentencing guidelines unless it would be unjust to do so. I assume that would be in cases of miscarriages of justice or something. So that's basically it. Parliament, the Sentencing Council, and judges all have a role to play. I'm saying that all three continue to be too out of touch. The Sentencing Council, as you can see in that response, they're quite defensive. Um, it's a better response than I've had before, but I would still say to them, look, in this case, and I know you're not going to comment on it, but in this case, the perpetrator got 2 years. The maximum is 5 years. So why did he not get 5 years? Probably it'll be, oh, the mitigating factor was he pled guilty early on. But even with that, okay, give him 4 years. 2 years is just ridiculous. Um, I will concede this. I'm humble enough to make concessions where appropriate. I have put a lot of frustration and blame on the Sentencing Council because I'd always thought, well, parliamentarians, they're going to be generally tougher on crime because they know it's in the political interest to be so. So they'll have limited power on actual sentencing, and that's true. However, with that focus on maximum and minimum sentencing, maybe parliamentarians do have more power on this than I had anticipated. They may not have the power, they certainly cannot intervene in individual cases, but there is a strong argument that there should be tougher minimum sentences, particularly for cases like this. Maybe there should be more focus, after all, on elected parliamentarians. But I maintain that the Sentencing Council is important. Um, I mean, I'm still very frustrated with them. I don't think that they go far enough, and I don't really agree that they're just working within the framework that Parliament sets, in the sense that they are the people responsible for drafting the framework. Okay, so yes, they have to work within the maximum and minimum, but they could still issue tougher guidelines to judges. I'm not convinced that. I mean, based on this response, they're sort of finally, which is what I wanted. I wanted them to sort of say, "Look, we are tougher than you're alleging," because I wanted them to prove me wrong. Have they done that? I'm not really sure they've done that, but I will concede that maybe I put a bit too much blame on them. I'll concede that. I'll concede that. Um, anyway, I'll probably respond to them thanking them for their message, but I still think there's enormous frustration out there. If someone that I cared about was paralyzed for life and the perpetrator got 2 years, I would be hopping mad about it. So the collective establishments, Parliament, the Sentencing Council, and judges have to answer to this. I still don't think they go far enough, even if they have toughened it. Um, so, yeah. Anyway, it's something to think about. Thanks for watching. But more broadly, I do think that reckless driving is one of those things that it just, like young offenders, violent young offenders, it just continues to be met with far too much leniency. Like I say, this young man didn't go out that day to seriously hurt this woman. I understand that. So I wouldn't treat him the same as a knife thug, for example. But his selfishness and his recklessness done precisely that. I suppose some would say, well, he's going to carry the guilt around for the rest of his life. He may or he may not. I didn't follow the case closely, so I don't know how much remorse he showed. The reports that I read certainly didn't suggest that he did show remorse. I think that should be a factor in sentencing for sure. If he showed deep remorse, if I were the judge, I'd make it something of a mitigating factor. I still think 2 years is too lenient. I would, okay, let's say the threshold is 5 years, I'd give him 4.5, with the only mitigating being that he admitted guilt early and he showed remorse. But I think 2 years is far too lenient. Final point. I suppose we could look at it one other way. Prison is not a picnic, despite what the tabloids say. It is not fun. Prison in this country is definitely tougher than it would be in, say, Sweden or the Netherlands. So I suppose we could look at it as 2 years. It's a young offender institute, but still no picnic. It's kind of like 4 years on the outside because days drag. So I suppose look at it that way. But I still maintain 2 years is far too lenient. Let me know your thoughts based on everything I've said here. Thanks for watching.